Thank you for tuning in to Short Fiction Lab. You're listening to Infinite Survival Subway Escape Game. This is the first story in a 5-story series. Welcome to the Subway Escape Game. The game will begin in 10 minutes. During the announcement period, please remain quiet. Any noise will be treated as a violation and punished accordingly. The moment I stepped into the subway car, a cold, mechanical voice echoed in my ears. A passenger nearby was loudly complaining into his phone. "Who's blasting their phone on speaker like that? Don't you have any manners?" The words had barely left his mouth when, boom, his head burst apart like fireworks. From the man's neck, a dark red flower slowly began to grow. At first it was only a small bud, but as his body gradually withered, the flower continued to expand. By the time it fully bloomed, his body had been completely drained. Flesh, bones, even organs were gone, as if absorbed by the flower as nourishment. All that remained was a shriveled sack of skin. Everyone froze in silence for a few seconds. Then the screams erupted all at once. "Ah! Someone's attacking people!" Many thought it was a terrorist attack. People clutched their heads and ran in all directions. Some even slammed against the subway doors, desperately trying to escape, but it was useless. I stood quietly in the corner of the car, watching as the screaming crowd, one by one, turned into bursts of fireworks, their bodies drained by the red flowers. 1 person, 2, 3. The continuous explosions only fueled the panic. The screams grew louder. Some people pulled out their phones to call the police, but without exception, the moment a sound escaped, their lives ended. In the end, the survivors finally remembered the mechanical announcement. They hurriedly clamped their mouths shut, trembling, not daring to make a single sound. The subway car was now filled with human skin sacks. One lay directly in front of me. I frowned in disgust and stepped back several paces. After a short while, the mechanical voice echoed again. It was still cold and emotionless, yet this time, I sensed a faint note of gloating in it. "All rule-breaking players have been dealt with. A total of 132 players have been eliminated. 36 players remain. The remaining number of players is too low and will be consolidated into 3 subway cars, 12 players per car." I shuddered. In just a few short minutes, more than 100 people had died. What exactly was this mechanical voice? A terrorist organization? A hostile force? How could it eliminate people so quickly and effortlessly? How interesting. I blinked, hiding the excitement flashing through my eyes. Just then, the lights inside the subway car flickered several times. When they returned to normal, I suddenly realized that all the corpses had vanished. The floor and the glass doors were spotless, as clean as new, without a single trace left behind, as if no one had ever died here at all. But several new people had appeared inside the car. There had originally been 5 survivors. Now, there were 12. It was likely the result of the car consolidation mentioned by the mechanical voice. The newcomers looked around in panic, suspicion written all over their faces, yet not a single one of them dared to speak. I stopped paying attention to them and shifted my gaze to the large screen inside the subway car. It was mounted to the right of the doors. I remembered that it usually played advertisements or public service announcements. Now, the screen was pitch black, as if powered off. But if one looked closely, the faint outline of a human face could be seen. I stared at the screen intently. Suddenly, a doll's face appeared. The doll's pupils were enormous, almost filling its entire eye sockets, glowing a vivid red that was terrifying to behold. Its mouth stretched all the way to its ears. With the slightest movement, rows of white teeth were revealed. No, its teeth were not completely white. If you looked closely, you could see dark, blotchy bloodstains on them, with bits of flesh still lodged between the gaps. Everyone was horrified by the scene. A female high school student sucked in a sharp breath and instinctively tried to scream, but the man in a suit beside her reacted quickly, clamping a hand over her mouth and forcing the scream back down her throat. Realizing the situation, the girl froze in terror, cold sweat breaking out across her body. She looked at the suited man with gratitude. Perhaps because it failed to scare anyone, the doll appeared displeased. Its lips moved as it spoke, its mechanical voice growing even colder. What was truly horrifying, however, was that as it spoke, its lips and tongue trembling, bits of flesh lodged between its teeth continuously fell out. With a sharp eye, I noticed that among the falling scraps of flesh was a piece of dark blue fabric. If I remembered correctly, the first man whose head had exploded like fireworks had been wearing a dark blue shirt. An unsettling thought crossed my mind. Could it be that all the dead passengers had become food for the doll? Before I could think any further, the doll began announcing the next round of the game. Attention players, the first game is about to begin. Game theme, The Silent Villagers. Game introduction, night has fallen. The monster is about to appear, yet the lazy villagers are still wandering outside, unable to return home in time. The villagers must evade the monster's pursuit and return home safely in order to survive. Note, the monster has poor vision and no sense of smell, but their hearing is extremely sensitive. The villagers must not be discovered under any circumstances, otherwise, heh. The laughter, mixed with the crackling sound of electricity, was unbearably eerie. I swept my gaze across the car and noticed several passengers. No, I should call them players now, whose faces had turned deathly pale. After laughing to its heart's content, the doll continued. The game preparation period has now begun. Players may freely discuss and exchange information. No actions during this time will be punished. In 5 minutes, the game will officially begin. The electronic screen flickered several times. The doll's face vanished, replaced by a dark red 5-minute countdown timer. The car erupted into murmurs. Some people broke down in sobs. Others desperately tried to call their families or contact the police, only to discover in despair that there was no connection to the outside world. There were even a few who seemed strangely eager, brimming with excitement as they awaited the upcoming game. Fortunately, no one completely lost control. The scene of heads exploding like fireworks did not repeat itself. A single word suddenly flashed through my mind: screening. That initial mass death, rather than a punishment, felt more like a filtering process. The doll's actions resembled randomly selecting a large group of people, then using a terrorist-like incident to eliminate the majority, leaving only those who met the criteria to participate in the game. The countdown timer steadily approached its final minute. Although the players were allowed to communicate freely, the presence of something so far beyond human understanding had left everyone stunned. No one was in the mood to talk. People remained silent where they stood or sat. Very soon, the countdown reached 0. The doll's face appeared on the screen once more. This time, its voice was far more excited. The first game, The Silent Villagers, now officially begins. Villagers, please make full use of your intelligence and do your best to escape the monster. The final survivor will receive a corresponding reward. Those who fail will be punished. The moment the doll finished speaking, my vision was swallowed by darkness. When I opened my eyes again, I found myself standing in a primitive village. Vast rice fields stretched out beneath my feet. In the distance, the sun was slowly sinking, on the verge of disappearing completely. I was still wearing my own clothes. My backpack and phone were still with me. Only the surrounding environment had changed, as if I had been transported to a completely unfamiliar place. Sweeping my gaze across the area, I confirmed that all 12 players were present. Their positions and order were exactly the same as in the subway, except that now everyone was standing. It's beautiful. The girl standing beside the man in the suit looked toward the distant mountains and murmured unconsciously. I followed the direction she was pointing. The slanting rays of the setting sun painted the clouds that shrouded the towering mountain range in brilliant colors. It truly was a rare sight, something you would never see in a city of concrete and steel. At a time like this, you're still in the mood to admire the scenery? Someone muttered unhappily. It's just a game. What's there to be afraid of? The speaker was a young man in his early 20s with dreadlocks, dressed in edgy streetwear. Didn't the doll already say it? The monster only has extremely sensitive hearing. When it shows up, all we have to do is stay quiet. Nothing will happen. He shot a contemptuous glance at the person who had spoken earlier. I didn't say anything, but inwardly, I disagreed with him. If staying silent were truly enough, then we had already cleared a round before the game even began. There would be no need to deliberately set up an additional game, which meant one thing was certain. There had to be something more to it. In other words, there was definitely a trap. The sun quickly sank completely below the horizon. The last trace of light vanished, and night fell. Aside from us, the players, the entire village was silent. There wasn't a single sound. The night wind swept through the area, making the atmosphere even more gloomy and terrifying. The breathtaking scenery from moments ago now felt like nothing more than a cruel illusion. The man in the suit coughed lightly, pointed toward the distance, and said, "According to the game introduction, the monster is about to appear. Should we find a house to hide in?" Although phrased as a question, his tone was full of confidence, carrying a natural air of leadership. It was clear he wanted to take control, while everyone else was still trying to grasp the situation. Most people nodded in agreement. The suited man waved his hand and turned toward the nearest house. But after only a few steps, thud. His body jolted to a stop, as if he had slammed into a wall. There was nothing in front of him, no obstacle at all. The man in the suit stared in disbelief. Rubbing his head, he tremblingly reached forward. At arm's length, his hand pressed against something solid, an invisible wall. "What the hell is this?" someone asked in panic. I watched them coldly as they flailed about in confusion, groping the air like a troop of clowns. Idiots. A sudden sound echoed from the distance. Boom! 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 Along with it came a massive shadow, a four-legged monster slowly advancing toward us. This was likely the monster the doll had mentioned. Everyone's faces turned deathly pale. Panic intensified. People desperately tried to flee, only to crash repeatedly into the invisible wall. I frowned. I hadn't planned on helping them, but once the monster got closer, their panic could easily cause them to make noise, and that would very likely drag me down with them. "Stop looking for an exit. The subway doors haven't even opened yet. How exactly do you think you're going to get out?" The man in the suit turned toward me, impatience flashing across his face. "What do you mean?" "I mean exactly what I said." Ignoring his rudeness, I spoke bluntly. "Haven't you realized it yet? We're still on the subway. Everything you're seeing is an illusion." The other players looked doubtful, clearly unconvinced. The dreadlocked young man even sneered. "Did you get scared out of your mind, saying something this crazy? Figures? Women always hold everyone else back when things go wrong." The man in the suit crossed his arms, looking as if I were talking nonsense. "Miss, on what basis are you making this judgment?" I took 2 steps to the left, then sat down without hesitation and tossed my backpack toward the 2 o'clock direction. Everyone's eyes widened. From their perspective, both my body and the backpack were suspended in midair. But in reality, I was sitting on a subway seat, and my backpack was caught in the gap between 2 handrails. This was the first trap of the game. We were still inside the subway car, deceived by visual illusions into believing we were in a village. If the monster appeared before anyone uncovered the truth, then once the players tried to run, they would inevitably slam into doors or seats, or even trip over the handrails. And in the chaos, the moment someone screamed, the outcome would be immediate death at the monster's hands. I raised an eyebrow and looked at the 2 of them with open mockery. "If you still don't understand, I can explain it again." The dreadlocked young man's face went pale. He turned away without saying another word. The man in the suit was just about to speak when his expression suddenly froze in horror. His eyes widened as he stared straight ahead, lips pressed tightly together. The shadow that had been distant only moments ago was now right in front of us, at the very front of the subway car. At last, the players clearly saw what the monster looked like. It stood upright, over 4 meters tall. Its massive body was grayish-blue in color, covered entirely in hard scales. From the gaps between those scales, a green liquid continuously seeped out. When the liquid dripped onto the ground, the floor immediately let out a sizzling sound, releasing black smoke that kept rising into the air. I followed the shape upward and finally saw the monster's face, though it could hardly be called a face at all. Its enormous mouth took up nearly half of its head. Inside were countless tiny black tentacles, constantly writhing. Its eyes bulged outward, yet its eyelids were tightly shut, revealing no whites at all. The eyelids were covered in cracks, and every time the monster's head swayed, a thick fluid dripped from them. The liquid flowed into its mouth, burning the tentacles, only for them to split apart and regenerate again and again. The sight was utterly horrifying, enough to make anyone feel sick. All the players struggled to suppress their instinctive urge to vomit, but not everyone could endure it. Grrr! A middle-aged woman finally lost control and bent over, retching loudly. Everyone froze. The instant the sound escaped her mouth, the monster lunged toward her at terrifying speed. It lowered its head and opened its mouth, and countless tentacles shot out, wrapping tightly around her body and lifting her into the air. "No, no, please spare me! My child is still waiting for me to come home!" The woman cried out in despair, her legs kicking wildly. But it was completely useless. The monster did not hesitate. The tentacles retracted, pulling her straight into its mouth. A single piercing scream rang out. Then everything fell silent. Only the sound of chewing remained, chilling to the bone. In the dead silence, that sound was amplified to the extreme. One could clearly hear flesh being crushed, bones snapping, even the tearing of organs. Some players were so terrified they could barely stand, yet they didn't dare make a sound and could only force themselves to stay upright. A sharp, acrid smell suddenly spread through the air. I turned my head and saw a bald, middle-aged man who had been frightened to the point of wetting himself. But no one laughed at him. Not even the dreadlocked young man said a word. Faced with such a grotesque scene, the nerves of most of the players were already on the verge of collapse. A few minutes later, the monster finally finished savoring its meal. Standing directly behind where the middle-aged woman had been was the dreadlocked young man. The monster took a few steps forward and stopped right in front of him. The dreadlocked young man adapted quickly. Though his body was still slightly stiff, his expression had already returned to normal. Facing the massive monster, he showed no fear at all. There was even a hint of excitement in his eyes. His expression clearly said, "As long as I don't make a sound, you won't discover me." Everyone thought the same. But what shocked all the players was that the monster did discover him. It opened its mouth, swung its arms through the air twice, then lowered its head. Using the exact same method as before, it swallowed the dreadlocked young man whole, without the slightest hesitation. Even the dreadlocked young man himself had no time to react. His scream rang out only once before it was abruptly cut off. A violent wave surged through my mind. He hadn't spoken. He hadn't panicked and run, creating footsteps. He hadn't collided with anything. So why had he been discovered? Before I could figure it out, my vision suddenly darkened. The monster was now standing right in front of me, its mouth slowly opening. Inside, countless tentacles were still tearing apart and digesting the dreadlocked young man's body. If I didn't understand why he had been discovered, then in just a moment, the body being torn apart would be mine. A powerful survival instinct forced my brain into overdrive. In that brief instant, a single word seized my mind: breathing. That's right. Damn breathing. The doll had only said that the monster had extremely sensitive hearing. It never said how sensitive. Sensitive enough to hear breathing. This was the true difficulty of the game. I didn't have time to curse the doll's cruelty. I immediately held my breath to avoid being detected. When the other players saw me pinch my nose shut, they instantly understood and followed suit. Sure enough, once we stopped breathing, the monster's mouth stopped opening wider. But it still stood there, unmoving, showing no sign of leaving. My lungs had limits. If I couldn't find a way to make it go away, I would eventually suffocate and become its food. My brain raced wildly, yet I still couldn't find a solution. Second by second, time dragged on. My lungs spasmed violently, burning with pain as the oxygen inside was nearly depleted. I bit down hard on my lip until blood seeped out, wetting my tongue. The pain helped keep me conscious, but this wasn't a solution. 10 seconds. Just 10 more seconds and I wouldn't be able to hold on. My gaze flicked toward the high school girl. She stared at me, face pale, fear filling her eyes. In a situation with no clear escape, no one wanted to see another player die. But I wasn't looking at her face. I was looking at the phone hanging in front of her chest. Her body trembled slightly, and the phone swayed with it. I quickly pulled out my backup phone from my pocket and opened the music app. Without hesitation, I pressed play and hurled the phone toward the empty corner of the subway car. The moment the phone hit the floor, music rang out. At the same time, the monster instantly turned its head and charged toward the sound. Tiny tentacles shot out and wrapped tightly around the phone. It worked. I let out a long breath, only then realizing that my back was already soaked with cold sweat. The other players also showed signs of relief. As long as they followed this method, they could temporarily escape the monster's pursuit. But this was not a foolproof strategy. The number of phones was limited. There was no way to keep luring the monster away indefinitely. Once all the phones were destroyed, we would still be driven into a dead end. Moreover, even throwing a phone was not completely safe. Some players were too tense. Before they could throw their phones far enough, the music had already started playing. They unsurprisingly became the monster's next meal. I began to recall what the doll had said. The villagers must escape the monster's pursuit and return home safely in order to survive. This game actually had two objectives. The first objective was to survive the monster, which I had just barely accomplished. The second objective was to go home. Only by returning home could the game truly end. But how were we supposed to go home? Judging from the surroundings, it was obvious that we needed to enter the houses in the village. Those places must represent the villagers' homes. But everything we were seeing was an illusion. We couldn't step out of the subway car, let alone enter any houses. So what exactly did home mean? Go home, enter the door, open the door. That's it. To go home, you first need a key. I began carefully scanning the entire subway car, searching for a key or anything similar. I didn't know whether this line of thinking was correct, but at this point, all I could do was try. Seeing me take action, the other players looked at me questioningly. I took out another phone and typed a message. Look for a key or something similar to return home. The players immediately understood and began searching carefully. Second by second, time slipped by. We had to search meticulously while making absolutely no sound. Everyone was drenched in sweat. During this time, the monster destroyed several more phones. In the end, only the high school girl's phone remained. One player tried throwing a shoe, but it couldn't produce sound continuously. It only drew the monster's attention for a brief moment and was largely ineffective. At the rate the monster was consuming phones, we had less than 1 minute left. I pressed my lips together, hands searching frantically. Fear was useless. Anxiety was pointless. If I wanted to survive, the only option was to move faster. 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 Suddenly, music echoed from a distance, followed immediately by the monster's roar. I snapped my head up and saw the high school girl's pale face. Her arm was still frozen in the position of having just thrown her phone. Don't panic. Don't panic. After steadying my breathing, I immediately turned back and continued searching. Sweat from my forehead ran into my eyes, burning painfully, but I had no time to wipe it away. The music stopped. The sound of chewing disappeared as well. The monster had finished eating and began searching again. Despair spread through the silent space. The bald, middle-aged man who had wet himself had even given up searching entirely, collapsing onto the ground and staring blankly into the distance. The air suddenly grew suffocating. Every cell in my body was screaming danger. My survival instincts were sounding the alarm. I stiffened and slowly lifted my head, only to discover the monster standing right beside me, at my right hand. Its greedy tentacles stretched outward, searching for the next target to devour. I wiped the sweat from my eyes forcefully, and suddenly, I noticed an ear of rice beneath my feet. The village scenery might have been an illusion, but the rice fields beneath us were real. At least, the sensation was real. I bent down and stared intently at the rice stalk. Compared to the others, it was slightly different. Its stem was thicker, the grains were fuller, and at the very center, one grain emitted a faint, shimmering glow. But because rice was naturally golden, it was nearly impossible to notice without looking closely. I held my breath and reached for the stalk. The moment I plucked it, a brilliant light burst forth. In an instant, the rice transformed into a key. Ding dong! Congratulations to player Evelyn Hart for successfully finding the way home. Game cleared. This game had 7 survivors and 5 deaths. Clearance rank, B, rest time awarded 10 minutes. The second game will begin in 10 minutes. During the rest period, players may act freely. No actions will be punished. As the electronic voice sounded, my vision sank into darkness once again. When the light returned, the illusion and the monster had vanished. The real subway car reappeared before us. Everyone looked at me. There was caution in their eyes, but also gratitude. After a brief silence, the man in the suit walked over and smiled. "You're Evelyn Hart, right? We really have to thank you for what just happened. Without you, we probably wouldn't have survived." His smile was perfectly practiced, but it couldn't hide the jealousy in his eyes. "Oh, so that's it." He resented me for stealing his spotlight. I ignored his smile and replied coolly, "I was only saving myself. I had no intention of helping you." Perhaps because he felt humiliated, his smile vanished instantly. Anger flooded his face, and he began rambling, criticizing me. Arrogant, rude, overly conceited. Familiar words. They slipped into my ears and drifted right back out. It wasn't just him. From childhood to adulthood, I had heard these words countless times. A psychologist once said there was nothing wrong with my mental state, only that I was born with a deficiency in emotional response. The fact that I hadn't turned into a sociopath was already fortunate enough. There was no need to demand more. If even I didn't place demands on myself, what right did others have to control me? So I couldn't be bothered to listen to the man in the suit, but he was so irritating that it gave me a headache. Finally, I lost all patience and said coldly, "If you have the leisure to criticize me, then you must have already figured out the content of the next round." The man in the suit froze, clearly caught off guard. "The next round hasn't even been announced yet. What is there to think about?" I let out a cold laugh. He liked showing off. He liked basking in attention. He liked being the center of the group. That was why, in the early stages of the game, he was always eager to play the role of leader. And that was also why, when I cleared the game successfully and showed him no respect, he had been so deeply wounded. But the most infuriating thing about him was his stupidity and his complete lack of self-awareness. The process of the first game had been clear. Announce the rules, rest period, then start the game. If the same process were followed, the doll should have announced the content and rules of the second game first, then allowed a rest period, and only after that begun the game. But this time, the order had been reversed. Why? The only explanation I could think of was that the doll was deliberately trying to prevent the players from exchanging too much information. If the rules were announced too early, the players would likely discuss strategies in advance. If my guess was correct, the next game would definitely involve information. I lifted my head and swept my gaze across the surviving players in the subway car. The foolish and arrogant man in the suit, the timid high school girl, the cowardly bald middle-aged man, a silent couple that seemed almost non-existent, and an elementary school boy. Wonderful. I had absolutely no interest in talking to any of them. 10 minutes later, the doll's electronic voice rang out right on time. The rest period has ended. The content of the second game will now be announced. Game theme: The Monster's Revenge. Game introduction. Unable to consume all the villagers, the monster has become enraged and decided to seek revenge. It has secretly possessed a villager and hidden itself among the group, intending to eliminate all villagers at once. Game rules. The monster is currently hiding among the villagers. Players must work together to identify it. After the game begins, each player will receive a dagger. Stabbing the monster in the heart counts as successfully clearing the game. Note: the game time limit is 30 minutes. Exceeding this time will be considered a failure. Villagers are forbidden from killing one another. If a player stabs a teammate, it will be considered an individual failure. Find the monster hiding among you. Good luck. Before the doll could finish speaking, I interrupted. This isn't fair. On the electronic screen, the doll's previously gentle face twisted abruptly. The red light in its eyes flared brighter and brighter, filled with bloodlust. Any player who makes noise during a game announcement will be dealt with according to the rules. Has this player forgotten already? I nodded and replied calmly, I haven't forgotten. But in the previous round, I was the one who found the key and cleared the game. And yet, all I received was a 10-minute rest period shared by the entire group. There was no individual reward. That isn't fair. You are the executor of the game's rules. I have the right to question your abuse of authority. Is there a way to file a complaint? I would like to lodge one against you. The doll's expression froze. Its distorted smile remained, but the screen suddenly dissolved into static. A few seconds later, it reappeared. The horrifying, cold expression on its face had returned to calm. Greetings, player Evelyn Hart. Round 1 was a group clear game and did not include individual rewards. The game rules contain no errors. However, it has been detected that you demonstrated outstanding performance during the game. I can therefore grant you one opportunity to ask a question. Any question you wish, I will answer. Would you like to use this opportunity now? The red glow in its eyes dimmed by more than half, and its oversized mouth returned to normal. If one ignored the unnaturally large pupils that filled its eyes, it almost looked like an ordinary doll, like it was deliberately trying to appear gentle. But I could hear the reluctance in its voice, teeth grinding with barely concealed hostility, as if it wanted nothing more than to swallow me whole. I didn't care about its attitude and calmly accepted the opportunity. In the second round, the player's objective is to find the monster. Then what is the monster's objective? Does it need to eat people during the game, or does it simply need to survive until the end? The doll bared its teeth in a cold grin. The monster's objective is to survive until the game ends. Its reward will be that all players become its food. So the monster would not actively attack players during the game. Doing so would only expose its identity and lead to failure. It seemed I didn't need to worry about being attacked by the monster during the game itself. My answer is complete. Is player Evelyn Hart satisfied? I nodded and smiled as well. I have no further questions. Start round 2. I want to go home. At that moment, the doll's fake, gentle expression was instantly torn away. Its face twisted into something ferocious and bloodthirsty. Its mouth stretched wide as it said excitedly, "Not so fast. Your reward has already been granted. Now, we will carry out the punishment for making noise while I was announcing the game." The moment its words fell, a red mark suddenly appeared around my neck, accompanied by an intense burning pain. The mark tightened little by little, as if it were about to sever my head. Through the electronic screen, I stared straight into the doll's pupils. They were filled with greed and anticipation, as if it had already seen my body drained of blood in an instant, shriveling into a dried corpse. "You're mistaken. I didn't violate the rules," I said calmly. The red mark, tightening around my neck, stopped, The doll's voice became sharp and grating. "I clearly heard it. You spoke while I was announcing the game rules." "You remembered wrong." I corrected it seriously. "I only spoke after you finished announcing the rules. You definitely have a recording. You can review it. When I spoke, you were wishing everyone good luck. That doesn't count as announcing the game rules. At most, it was small talk." The doll froze again, clearly enraged by me. The red mark on my neck tightened, then loosened, tightening again. But in the end, it did not cut off my head. After a long moment, it decisively ignored me and said unwillingly, "Round 2 officially begins." A 30-minute countdown timer appeared on the screen. This time, however, no illusions appeared before the players. Perhaps my exchange with the doll had been too shocking. The other players all stared at me, as if they had many questions but didn't dare to speak. The man in the suit cleared his throat again, reclaiming control of the situation. "The rules say we need to find the monster. I suggest everyone talks about their own situation first. Maybe we can find clues through conversation." He glanced at me warily. "Miss Evelyn Hart, why don't you start?" I toyed with the dagger that had just appeared in my hand, adjusting my grip, not bothering to look up. "You all go ahead. I have nothing to say." He immediately flew into a rage, his face twisted with hostility as he snapped, "How can you be like this? This game clearly requires teamwork to clear. If you refuse to cooperate, could it be that you are the monster?" When people are uneasy, a single accusation, no matter how baseless, can be lethal. The high school girl sitting across from me stiffened and shifted a few centimeters to the left. The bald man sitting one seat away on my left wiped sweat from his forehead, looking flustered. Yet his dagger was pointed straight at me. Even the elementary school boy, who had barely seemed to exist before, now looked at me with open hostility. I glanced coldly at the man in the suit. "You suspect me of being the monster? Then why don't you make a move?" "You don't dare because you're afraid of being wrong. But because I stand out too much, you also can't rest easy. So instead, you say it out loud and try to incite everyone else to unalive me. Isn't that right?" The man in the suit's face gradually turned pale. The expression clearly showed I had hit the mark. I had always thought he was just an idiot. I hadn't expected that, when his life was on the line, he could also be calculating. I didn't say the rest, but anyone with a brain could figure it out. If someone unalived me and I were the monster, the players would clear the game successfully. If I weren't the monster, the killer would be punished and eliminated. Either way, the number of suspects would instantly drop by 2, and the difficulty of the game would be significantly reduced. No matter how you looked at it, the outcome was extremely beneficial for the man in the suit. Seeing the change in the other's gazes, he licked his dry, cracked lips and shouted irritably, "What else could I do? I don't want to die. If you have a better idea, then go find the monster. What's the point of criticizing me?" Not wanting to die, so pushing others to take the risk instead. He even had the nerve to say something so shameless. I let out a soft, cold laugh and turned away, no longer willing to look at him. One more second would have been too much. What mattered now wasn't moral condemnation. It was finding the monster. Otherwise, when the countdown ended, everyone would die. In the end, the players began taking turns briefly explaining their situations, their professions, backgrounds, where they were headed on the subway that day, and so on. Everyone's statements were flawless. The situation fell into a deadlock. Despair was written clearly on every face. "Big sister, I'm so scared. Can you hold me for a moment?" Suddenly, the 10-year-old boy who had barely shown any presence until now ran over with tears in his eyes, acting spoiled toward the girl from the couple. The girl was wearing a long floral dress. She had a beautiful figure and face, and her gentle voice revealed that she was a kindergarten teacher. She froze slightly. Although she herself was terrified, she still reached out and held the boy, comforting him. "Don't be afraid. We'll make it out of here." "Ah, what are you doing?" Her gentle tone abruptly changed. She shoved the boy away forcefully, her face filled with shock and humiliation. The boy rubbed his palm and broke into a vulgar grin, completely inappropriate for his age. "So what if I touched you? You're dressed like that. Aren't you asking to be touched?" Everyone was stunned by his words. Even the girl's boyfriend failed to react in time. The boy rolled his eyes indifferently. "Anyway, I don't expect to survive. Before dying, can't I at least touch a woman once?" He suddenly leaned forward, bending close to the girl in the long dress, inhaling deeply. "Before, I could only secretly look at girl dance groups online. Today I finally got to touch one. Big sister, your body is really soft. You smell really nice, too." The girl clutched her chest with both hands, desperately backing away, crying and screaming, "How can you be so shameless?" Smack. A sharp sound rang out as the boy's face snapped to the side, a clear handprint appearing. The girl's boyfriend was red with rage. One slap wasn't enough. He grabbed the boy by the collar and slammed him hard onto the ground. Already acting like an animal at this age. "If your parents didn't teach you, I'll teach you myself." He was about to rush forward and hit him again when the boy suddenly pulled out a dagger, wildly slashing it in front of his chest and shouting, "If you've got the guts, come here. I'll go all out with you. Die together. I wasn't planning to live anyway. Dragging someone down with me isn't a loss." The girl's sobbing, her boyfriend's curses, and the boy's filthy words blended together into a chaotic mess, like a noisy marketplace. I rubbed my ear, just about to speak up to stop them, when a piercing scream from the girl suddenly echoed through the entire subway car. Her boyfriend stared down in disbelief. A dagger was buried deep in his chest. The other end of the dagger was still firmly gripped in the boy's hand. The chubby boy, round as a ball, his entire body thick with fat, bared his teeth in a vicious grin and shoved the dagger another 2 centimeters deeper. His voice was filled with undisguised malice. "Why do you get to live so long? And even have such a pretty girlfriend? I haven't even grown up yet and I have to die. Die! We still haven't found the monster. I definitely won't survive. So don't even think about living either. Let's die together." Evil does not discriminate by age. The young man's pupils slowly dilated. Blood spread across his chest, forming a brilliant red flower, a sight I had seen many times before, blooming on others' necks. The flesh and blood in his body were rapidly drained away. At the same time, the boy's head exploded like fireworks. In the blink of an eye, 2 living people were reduced to 2 hollow skins. "Ethan!" The girl in the long dress let out a heart-wrenching scream, rushing forward in madness to clutch the empty skin, trying desperately to hold it in her arms. The man in the suit immediately pulled her away, his expression full of irritation. "He's already dead. What's the point of crying? Instead of sitting there bawling, you'd better think about how to find the monster and escape this hellhole." The girl stood frozen for a moment, then broke down completely. "Ethan is dead. He died because of me. I don't want to live anymore either." The man in the suit said coldly, without a trace of emotion, "If you don't want to live, then hurry up and die. That'll just help us eliminate another suspect." Perhaps overwhelmed by grief, the girl failed to hear the sarcasm in his words. She actually picked up a dagger and slowly stabbed it toward her own heart. "Sorry for causing trouble. I couldn't hold back anymore." Pointing at the man in the suit, I cut in. "If you don't want to live anymore, then you might as well stab him too. That way you eliminate 2 people at once and our chances of winning increase." The man in the suit stared at me blankly, so shocked he couldn't utter a word. But his eyes were fixed on me, clearly asking, "How can you be even more shameless than I am?" I gave a faint smile. "I've never liked you. Might as well start with you." Interrupted by me, the girl finally abandoned her intention to unalive herself. She silently wiped away her tears, curled up in a corner, and didn't say a word. On the electronic screen, the countdown timer had reached the final 3 minutes. Aside from the deaths of 2 players, the game's progress had made no headway at all. The man in the suit finally lost his pretense of civility and began frantically demanding to know who the monster was. The high school girl trembled, shoulders shaking as she sobbed quietly. I twirled the dagger in my hand, glanced at the bald man beside me, and asked, "If we don't find the monster in 3 minutes, we'll all die. Aren't you afraid?" The bald man's face was filled with misery. He forced out a smile. "What's the point of being afraid? I've already prepared myself to die." I let out a calm "oh" and praised him sincerely. "Last round, you were so scared you wet yourself. This round, you can face death calmly. You adapt pretty fast." "What do you mean by that?" The bald man frowned, clearly uncomfortable. "I mean..." I tightened my grip on the dagger and swung my arm swiftly, stabbing it straight into his heart. Thud. The sound of the blade piercing flesh rang out. I smiled coldly. "I'm very curious. When did you possess this man's body?" No red flower bloomed on his chest. Instead, countless tentacles writhed outward. They didn't emerge only from his chest. Tentacles burst from his eyes, nose, mouth, ears, and even his anus, ravenously devouring his body from the inside out. In just a few seconds, the bald man was completely consumed. Not even bones remained. The countdown timer stopped at 59 seconds. The electronic screen flickered several times. The doll's face appeared once more. Congratulations to player Evelyn Hart for successfully identifying the hidden monster. Round 2 has been cleared. Clearance rank A. Rest time awarded 10 minutes. This time, the doll's electronic voice sounded utterly lifeless. After delivering just those 2 lines, it vanished immediately, as if it didn't want to remain even a second longer. "How did you know?" The man in the suit wiped his face and looked at me as if he were staring at a monster. In truth, it was very simple. From the very beginning of round 2, I had been observing whether anyone behaved abnormally. When everyone took turns introducing themselves, no one revealed any obvious flaws. That was exactly what I had expected. Since the monster was capable of possession, it must also be able to extract the host's memories. So I focused entirely on their external behavior. At first, I suspected the 10-year-old boy. Before fully understanding the monster, actively approaching any player was an unwise move. But the outcome proved that both the boy and the man he killed were ordinary humans. The pool of suspects narrowed to 4. The high school girl, the woman in the long dress, the man in the suit, and the bald, middle-aged man. The first person I ruled out was the man in the suit. From the start, he had been trying to incite the players to kill one another, but if players died in this round, their flesh would be drained by the red flower and would not become food for the monster. That directly contradicted the monster's objective, to survive until the end and devour everyone. The remaining 3 showed no obvious abnormalities, but that was precisely the problem. The bald man was too quiet. In the first round, when the monster devoured other players, he was so terrified that he wet himself. Clearly someone with extremely poor psychological resilience. But in this round, every time I secretly observed him, he was eerily calm, as if everything happening in the subway car had nothing to do with him. Even when the man in the suit, who cared deeply about appearances, fell into panic, the bald man remained silent. Yet when the man in the suit accused me, the bald man immediately followed along, displaying hostility. And when I addressed him directly, he quickly put on a show of fear and despair. He was clearly trying very hard to appear normal. By then, the range of suspects had already narrowed to 3. Even though I wasn't completely certain, the bald man's abnormality was enough for me to strike. Acting on instinct was better than sitting still and waiting to die. Fortunately, I was right. Ignoring the cold sweat and goosebumps covering my body, I let out a long breath, finally calming the wildly pounding heart in my chest. The high school girl lowered her head to thank me and apologized for having doubted me earlier. The woman in the long dress remained seated in a daze, unresponsive to everything around her. The man in the suit seemed to have finally been rendered speechless by me. He pursed his lips, but said nothing. Just then, the subway car doors suddenly opened. At the same time, the doll appeared again. Congratulations to the 4 players who have survived until this moment. I have prepared a rest area. Please proceed there to relax. After sufficient rest, you may return home. Was the game finally over? The man in the suit let out a long sigh of relief and stepped out of the subway car without hesitation, as if afraid the doors might close again the very next second. I hesitated slightly, then followed. As we rode the escalator out of the subway station, the sight before us stunned everyone. Endless night stretched into the distance. Heavy snow was falling. The ground was already covered in a thick layer, and every step sank nearly to the knees. Worse still, the temperature outside was unbearably low, easily -40°C. We were all wearing summer clothes. If we didn't find shelter quickly, we would freeze to death. Look, is that the rest area the doll mentioned? The high school girl suddenly pointed into the distance, shouting with excitement. I followed her finger. At the end of the wide road stood a red and white 2-story house. 2 street lamps flanked the entrance, casting a warm yellow glow that stood out vividly against the snow-covered world. The exterior of the house was painted a creamy white, and above the door hung a large red sign with clear lettering, "Welcome." As we drew closer, through the large transparent glass windows, we could clearly see people inside. Well-dressed men and women sat at dining tables, leisurely enjoying a feast. Every face wore a satisfied smile. Waiters in neat uniforms moved between the tables carrying trays, pouring wine, serving dishes, and fulfilling every request. The aroma of food and fine wine seemed to drift out of the house and into my nose. Let's go inside. There must be lots of good food in there. The high school girl rubbed her freezing shoulders, her eyes filled with longing. The man in the suit stepped forward immediately. The woman in the long dress, shivering from the cold, hurried after him. I hesitated again. In such freezing snow, a warm house like this was nothing short of a perfect shelter at the end of the world. Everything about it lured people inside. Too enticing, sweet to the point of feeling like a trap. "Hurry up! If we don't go in, we'll freeze to death out here!" the high school girl urged repeatedly. I clenched my teeth and followed her. She was right. I had no other choice. I had to go inside. The inside of the house was indeed warm. The moment I stepped through the door, I felt the blood in my body, nearly frozen solid, begin to flow again. Gentle piano music soothed nerves that had been stretched tight for so long. The cream-white European-style tables and chairs were both classical and elegant. A crystal chandelier hung at the center of the room, dazzlingly bright. After surviving so many dangers, this place felt like paradise on earth. Welcome, esteemed guests. May I ask what you would like to order? A waiter in a tailcoat approached, smiling as he handed us the menu. From rare delicacies to street snacks, the menu offered every kind of dish imaginable, even specialties from many different countries. The only odd thing was that the prices were not listed in money, but in points. What are these points? The man in the suit pointed at the prices and asked, puzzled. The waiter's polite smile did not fade at all as he replied, "Points can be exchanged for cash at a rate of 1 to 10,000. In other words, $1 equals 10,000 points." "So cheap?" the high school girl exclaimed in surprise. "A serving of lobster is only 7,800 points. That's not even $1. We always strive to provide our guests with the most comfortable experience," the waiter said proudly. "Our prices are absolutely preferential and will never make customers feel dissatisfied." "I'd like a beef Wellington," the man in the suit said, licking his lips, anticipation glittering in his eyes. "I want Boston lobster with cream puffs," the high school girl hurriedly added. Even the woman in the long dress, who had been immersed in grief and barely spoken, ordered a bowl of noodles with crab roe. "And this guest?" The waiter recorded the 3 orders, then turned to me. "May I ask what you would like?" "I'm not hungry. I don't want anything," I refused bluntly. A house appearing suddenly in the middle of a snowstorm was strange enough. Food this unbelievably cheap made me even more unwilling to touch it. Could such cheap dishes really be made from fresh ingredients? If not, then what were they made of? The moment I finished refusing, the smile on the waiter's face vanished instantly. His eyes turned cold as he stared straight at me. No, our establishment requires every guest to place an order. Every guest who enters must order. Refusal is not permitted. He repeated, "What would you like to eat?" I was certain that if I continued to refuse, I would either be thrown out or meet a far worse fate. Letting out a sigh, I had no choice but to lower my head and examine the menu carefully. Every dish looked colorful and delicious, and the prices were shockingly low. Yet the cheaper they were, the less I dared to order them. I slowly flipped through the not very thick menu. The waiter stood patiently at my side, showing no intention of leaving. Suddenly, my gaze stopped on a photograph. It was a very faint image, tucked away in the corner of the page among countless eye-catching dishes. The picture showed an ordinary bowl of plain white rice, simple, undecorated, completely out of place among the lavish delicacies surrounding it. But its price caught my attention. A single bowl of plain white rice cost 9.9 million points, equivalent to $9,900. Without hesitation, I pointed at it and said quickly, "I'll take this." The waiter froze for a moment, then forced a stiff smile. "Miss, plain white rice is the least valuable dish here. Are you sure you want to order this?" "Absolutely," I said without hesitation. Seeing that I would not change my mind, the waiter did not press further. He quickly wrote it down and said, "Very well, please choose your seats. The dishes will be served shortly." The food arrived quickly. I sat alone in a corner, holding my bowl of white rice, and looked up at the other 3 players, who were bent over their plates, savoring their meals. Their faces were filled with satisfaction and greed, no different from the other guests in the room. "Miss, why aren't you eating?" The waiter appeared out of nowhere, staring at me. "Wasting food will be punished. Guests must finish their meals." I couldn't refuse. I hurriedly brought the rice to my mouth. The taste was no different from any rice I had eaten before, yet I still felt uneasy. Suddenly, I noticed something horrifying. The food on the other 3 players' plates had changed. The carefully prepared meat was rotting at an astonishing speed, soon releasing a foul stench. Countless tiny white maggots appeared in the dark brown sauce. Yet none of the 3 noticed. They continued to eat ravenously. Rotten meat filled their mouths, even smeared across their faces, but their eating never stopped. If anything, it sped up. Their stomachs bulged larger and larger until they exceeded their limit and burst open. Their bellies exploded, yet they kept eating. After finishing the food on their plates, they looked around blankly. Then they rummaged through their ruptured stomachs, pulling out partially digested food and stuffing it back into their mouths, as if eternally starving, never able to stop. Suppressing my nausea, I suddenly thought of something and lowered my gaze to the bowl of white rice in front of me. It remained unchanged, plain and intact. I silently let out a breath of relief. If my guess was correct, those cheap dishes were made from the flesh and blood of dead players. The red flowers were likely where that flesh was stored. Since such meat cost nothing, it naturally didn't need to be sold at a high price. The bowl of white rice, on the other hand, was real food. And because the waiter deliberately steered players away from choosing it, its price was exorbitant. When I looked up again, everything around me had completely changed. The luxurious 2-story house had turned into a pile of ruins. The long white table before me had become a stainless steel table smeared with blood. The gentle piano music was gone, replaced by a familiar yet terrifying sound, the grinding of flesh and bone. The elegantly dressed guests, including the other 3 players, had become dried skeletons with bits of rotten flesh still clinging to them. "Miss, why aren't you eating anymore?" A skull suddenly appeared in front of me, empty black eye sockets staring straight at me. "Is the rice not to your taste?" I took a deep breath, forced myself to remain calm, and said, "Oh, I'm full. Could you please pack the rest for me to take away? I'll eat it later." The skull let out a strange laugh. Flesh slowly grew back over its face until it finally turned into a doll. Its eyes glowed red, and the familiar electronic voice rang out. "Congratulations to player Evelyn Hart for clearing the hidden stage, the final feast. Clearance rank A, game reward, return home." The moment it finished speaking, my vision went black, and I completely lost consciousness. When I opened my eyes again, I was lying in a hospital bed, my nose filled with the scent of disinfectant. Later, I learned from the news that the subway train I had been on had suffered a severe accident. Of the 132 people on board, only I survived. But what was the truth? Perhaps only I knew. After a month of recovery, my body fully healed. On the day I was being discharged, a delivery worker rushed over, handed me a bag, and said it was food I had ordered. But I hadn't ordered anything. Confused, I opened the bag, and my hand froze midair. Inside was a bowl of plain white rice. There was a small indentation in it, as if someone had already taken 2 bites. At that moment, my phone suddenly received a message. "Dear player Evelyn Hart, we confirm that you have successfully cleared the Subway Escape game and that your body has recovered well. We cordially invite you to participate in a new game 1 month from now. The time and location will be announced later. Please note, unless the invitee encounters an accidental death, this invitation cannot be refused." I hope you enjoyed this story. Please like this video and subscribe to support our channel so that I can bring more stories like this to you.